The warning did not come with missiles. It didn't come with explosions. It didn't come with troops crossing borders or jets screaming across the sky. It came with words. But in geopolitics, some words carry the weight of war. And this time, those words came from Beijing. At first, the tone sounded familiar, measured, diplomatic, carefully phrased. China's foreign ministry described the U.S. blockade around Iran's ports and the Strait of Hormuz as dangerous and irresponsible. But beneath that language, something else was building. Because when a major power chooses its words carefully, it is often saying more than it appears. This was not just criticism, it was a signal. A signal that a line was being drawn, and that crossing it could trigger consequences far beyond the Gulf. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another waterway, it is the artery of the global economy. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil flows through it under normal conditions. Every tanker that passes through that narrow stretch of water carries not just fuel, but stability, pricing, energy security, and the fragile balance that keeps global markets functioning. And now, that artery is under pressure. After talks collapsed, the United States moved to enforce a naval blockade targeting Iranian ports, aiming to choke off maritime access and force strategic concessions. The move was immediate, decisive, and deeply controversial. Because while Washington framed it as pressure, others saw something else entirely: escalation. China saw escalation, and China reacted. Publicly, the message was simple: de-escalate, respect navigation, return to talks. Privately, the implications were far more serious. Because China is not just another observer in this crisis, it is one of the largest consumers of energy in the world. It depends heavily on oil flows that pass through the Gulf. And disruptions there do not just affect prices. They affect national strategy, economic stability, industrial output, long-term planning. And that is why Beijing's reaction matters. Because when energy security is threatened, China does not treat it as a regional issue. It treats it as a national priority. And when national priorities are at risk, options begin to expand. That is the part no one is talking about loudly. Because China's response does not have to be immediate. It does not have to be military. It does not have to mirror the actions of others. It can be something else entirely: calculated, layered, strategic. Because China's strength in moments like this is not rapid escalation. It is patience. It is positioning. It is the ability to shape outcomes over time rather than react instantly. And that is exactly what makes this moment so dangerous. Because while one side moves quickly, the other side begins thinking long-term. And long-term thinking changes everything. Because the question is no longer just about the blockade. It is about what the blockade creates, what it disrupts, what it signals, and what it allows. Because by moving to control access to the strait, the United States has not just applied pressure to Iran, it has introduced uncertainty into one of the most critical global choke points. And uncertainty is something China cannot ignore, because even before the blockade, disruptions in the region were already affecting energy flows. Shipments from the Middle East to China have reportedly dropped significantly due to conflict-related constraints. That is not just an economic issue, it is a strategic vulnerability, and vulnerabilities must be addressed. That is where the real story begins, because China now has options, not obvious ones, not dramatic ones, but powerful ones. Options that can reshape influence without firing a single shot. Options that can turn a crisis into leverage. Options that can quietly shift the balance of power. Because while the world focuses on the blockade itself, Beijing is likely asking a different question. How does this change the global system? Because every disruption creates opportunity. Every crisis opens space. Every escalation forces realignment. And the actors who recognize that early often gain the most. China understands that, because it has studied this pattern for decades. When others are distracted by conflict, focus on structure. When others are reacting to events, build systems. When others are escalating, expand influence quietly. That is the strategy. And the Strait of Hormuz may now be the stage where that strategy evolves. Because the blockade has done something profound. It has introduced friction into global energy markets. Oil prices have surged, shipping routes have been disrupted, markets have reacted, and economic uncertainty has increased worldwide. That creates pressure on governments, pressure on economies, pressure on alliances, and pressure always leads to change. The question is who benefits from that change? Because while some nations are forced to react, others can adapt. They can diversify supply, shift trade routes, strengthen alternative partnerships, and in doing so, reduce dependence on unstable regions. China has already begun that process, increasing imports from alternative suppliers, expanding energy partnerships beyond the Middle East, building resilience into its supply chains. That is not just adaptation, it is strategy, because every barrel of oil that comes from somewhere else is one less vulnerability. Every new route reduces risk, every partnership increases leverage, and over time those changes accumulate. They reshape the system. That is how power shifts, not always through confrontation, but through adaptation. That is why the warning matters, because it is not just about opposing the blockade, it is about signaling that the current path leads to instability, and instability creates consequences, not just military consequences, but economic ones, systemic ones, global ones. Because if the strait becomes a contested zone, the effects ripple outward. Markets fluctuate, inflation rises, growth slows. The IMF has already warned that conflict involving Iran could drag down global economic momentum and increase inflation risks. That is not theoretical. That is happening. And China sees that. It sees the risks, but it also sees the opportunities. Because while instability harms some, it benefits others. Those who can navigate it, those who can adapt faster, those who can position themselves as alternatives. That is the deeper layer of this crisis. Because while the surface story is about confrontation, the underlying story is about transformation. A transformation of how energy flows, how alliances operate, how power is distributed, and how influence is exercised. Because if the Strait of Hormuz becomes unreliable, the world will adjust. New routes will be developed. New suppliers will rise. New systems will emerge. And those systems will not necessarily look like the old ones. That is the long-term consequence. And that is why China's warning carries so much weight. Because it is not just reacting to the present, it is anticipating the future. A future where control of choke points matters less, where diversified supply matters more, where influence is built through infrastructure, trade, and resilience, rather than direct confrontation. That is the model China has been building, and crises like this accelerate it, because they expose weaknesses in the current system. They highlight vulnerabilities, they force change, and change creates openings. That is why Beijing's response is so measured, because it does not need to escalate immediately. It can wait, observe, adjust, position, and when the time is right, act. Not necessarily with force, but with influence, with leverage, with strategic advantage. That is the kind of power that defines the modern era. Not just the ability to fight, but the ability to shape outcomes. And that is what makes this moment so critical. Because while the world focuses on the immediate tension, the deeper shifts are already underway. Shifts that may redefine how global power operates, how conflicts are managed, how alliances are formed, and how influence is exercised. Because the blockade is not just a tactical move, it is a strategic signal. And China has responded with its own signal, a warning, a line, a message that escalation carries consequences, not just for one country, but for the entire system. And when the system is at risk, every major power begins thinking differently, acting differently, preparing differently. That is what is happening now. Not just in Washington, not just in Tehran, but in Beijing, quietly, strategically, deliberately. Because the most important moves are rarely the loudest. They are the ones that reshape the future without announcing themselves. And that future is now being shaped in real time. Because once a line is drawn in a place as critical as the Strait of Hormuz, everyone must decide how to respond. Carefully, strategically, knowing that every move carries weight. Because crossing that line may not trigger immediate war, but it may trigger something just as significant. a shift in the global balance of power. And once that shift begins, it is very difficult to reverse. That is the real story, not just the warning, but what the warning represents. A moment where the system is being tested, where power is being recalculated, where the future is being quietly rewritten, and where the next move may determine not just the outcome of this crisis, but the shape of the world that follows.